children who never came back. Welcome back to Sleepy History, where you can drift into a snooze with your favorite history tales. My name is River, and I will be your guide through one of the strangest mysteries ever recorded. Help us grow our community by liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. In 1284, in a small German town on the banks of the Weser River, something happened that no one has ever been able to fully explain. A group of children walked out of the city and never came back. Not a few, not one or two lost in a forest. A large group of children, gone, together, in broad daylight. Now, you've heard a version of this story before. Everyone has. The Pied Piper, the rats, the revenge, the flute that led the children away while the adults stood helpless and watched. But here's what they don't tell you in the fairy tale. There were no rats. That detail, the one central to every version of the story you've ever heard, was added centuries later. What the oldest documents actually say is far simpler and somehow far more disturbing. They say, children left Hamelin. They didn't come back. And then, almost nothing. Barely a word. A silence so thick and strange that it lasted for 700 years. Why would a city that meticulously recorded its taxes, its lawsuits, its land sales, why would that city go almost completely quiet about the worst thing that ever happened to it? Tonight, we're not going to talk about the fairy tale. We're going to talk about what actually happened. And I'll warn you, the real story doesn't have a satisfying ending. It just has a void. Part 1. The town at the edge of the story. Let's start by placing you in time, because context matters here more than almost anywhere else. The year is 1284. The place is Hamelin, spelled Hamel in German, a mid-sized trading town in what is now Lower Saxony, northern Germany. It sits along the Weser River, which means it's connected. Goods move through here. People move through here. News moves through here. Hanover is nearby. Brunswick is nearby. This is not the back of beyond. This is a functioning node in the commercial network of the Holy Roman Empire. And because Hamelin is functioning, it records things. Purchases, debts, property disputes, wills, church tithes. The bones of civic life. All written down with the particular tedium that makes historians very happy. The people of Hamelin in 1284 are not, by any modern standard, living easy lives. Childhood is not a protected stage of development. It is a brief runway before labor. Children work. They apprentice. They contribute. Losing a child is not only devastating personally, it destabilizes the household, the guild, the neighborhood. Now multiply that loss by 100 or more. A disappearance on that scale, in a city that size, would not be a tragedy. It would be a rupture, a crack running through the entire social structure of the place. And yet, the city kept recording its taxes, its lawsuits, its land sales, and about the children, almost nothing. That silence is the first strange thing, and it won't be the last. Part 2. What the documents actually say. The oldest sources that mention the Hamelin children are frustratingly spare. They don't tell a story. They record a fact the way you'd write down a debt or a death, with no surrounding emotion, no explanation, no attempt to make sense of it. The substance is always the same. A large number of children born in Hamelin left the city and did not return. Some versions add one detail. They were led by a man in conspicuous clothing, eye-catching, bright, out of place, who was likely a musician. They headed toward a hill near the city called the Koppenberg. That's it. That's what the earliest records give us. No rats, no deal broken, no magic, no divine punishment. Just, children walked out of the city behind a man with a flute, and then they were gone. What makes this genuinely unsettling, as opposed to just sad, is what's absent. No accusation, no named suspect, no reported search party, no official inquiry. Medieval towns were not passive when they suffered losses. They wrote things down, they assigned blame, they sought justice, or at least they sought meaning. Here the record simply stops. One key word does survive in some of the older German texts, verloren. Not dead, Not murdered, not taken, lost. Think about that distinction for a moment. In a culture that explained tragedy through divine will, through sin, through supernatural intervention, calling something lost rather than taken or punished is its own kind of admission. It suggests a community that didn't know what happened, that couldn't frame it, that had no category for it. The word lost is what you use when the story has no ending. Part 3. Who was the Piper? Let's talk about this musician. Because even stripped of the fairy tale, he doesn't disappear from the earliest sources. He's there, this figure in bright clothes, this outsider who arrived and then was gone. In medieval Europe, musicians were common travelers. Pipers, fiddlers, jugglers. They moved between cities, performed at fairs and public ceremonies, carried news from town to town. They were useful. They were also viewed with a kind of ambient suspicion that came with being a permanent outsider. You weren't from here. You didn't owe anyone here anything. You came, you played, you left. But here's something worth sitting with. In a largely illiterate society, music wasn't just entertainment. It organized people. It marked the rhythm of collective movement, religious processions, military marches, public assemblies. The person holding the instrument held, at least temporarily, a kind of authority. People followed the music because that's what music was for. Some of these traveling musicians also served as go-betweens, connecting communities, announcing opportunities, acting as informal recruiters for labor or settlement projects. Which brings us to the theory that, academically speaking, has the most traction. Part 4. The Eastern Migration. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Holy Roman Empire was expanding eastward. Feudal lords and church authorities needed people to populate thinly settled lands in what is now Poland, Bohemia, Silesia, Prussia. To attract settlers, they offered land grants, tax exemptions, legal protections. This was the Ostsiedlung, the Great Eastern Settlement, and it was massive. It reshaped the demographic map of Central Europe. Entire communities packed up and left. Contracts were signed, routes were arranged, and crucially, it was young people who went first. Young men without land. Young apprentices without futures. People with everything to gain from starting over somewhere no one had staked a claim yet. Here's where the linguistics get interesting. In medieval German, Kinder, the word we translate as children, could mean young people, adolescents. Not necessarily the small, helpless creatures the fairy tale shows us, but teenagers and young adults in their working prime. Linguist Jürgen Udolf spent years tracing medieval surnames and found something striking. Names traceable to the Hamelin region, Amel, Hamler, Amelnikov, appear in settlements to the east, Uckermark, Prignitz, parts of what is now northwestern Poland. Communities with place names and family names that echo faintly the town on the Weser. Echoes aren't proof, but they're something. The theory then is this: a recruiter, a locator in the official terminology of the time, came to Hamelin, offered something: land, a future, freedom from debt, and a group of young people, perhaps more than the city expected, perhaps more than anyone had agreed to, left with him. There is an even harder version of this hypothesis, that the children were not simply recruited, but sold or handed over. Communities under financial pressure sometimes received payment per able-bodied settler they could provide, the piper as broker, the children as the currency. No proof, but the framework existed. The practice existed elsewhere. And if the departure happened under circumstances the city found shameful or complicit, that would explain the silence. Not grief without words, grief with something to hide. Part 5. The other explanations, and why they don't quite fit. Of course, other theories have circulated for centuries, and fairness requires we look at them. Epidemic. Some historians have pointed to disease, a plague moving silently through the youngest and most vulnerable. But Hamelin's records from 1284 show no signs of widespread illness. The usual markers aren't there. No spike in wills, no disruption in church records, no crisis language in the documents that survive. The Children's Crusade. In 1212, in one of history's stranger episodes, thousands of young people across Europe began marching toward the Holy Land, inspired by visions and charismatic preachers. But that was 70 years before Hamelin. No documented link connects the two events, and religious fervour is conspicuously absent from everything written about the Hamelin disappearance. Dancing mania. This one is genuinely eerie, and it's worth taking seriously. Throughout medieval Europe, there were documented outbreaks of what contemporaries called dancing mania. Groups of people, often young, who would fall into frenzied, trance-like movement for hours. Some reported hearing music that wasn't there. In 1237, just decades before Hamelin, an episode was recorded in Erfurt involving a large group who danced through the streets in an apparent mass trance. Modern researchers interpret these episodes as psychosomatic responses to collective trauma, a community's nervous system expressing what it couldn't articulate. From this angle, the Piper is not a historical figure at all. He's a symbol, the embodiment of the impulse that pulled those young people out of ordinary life and into something no one around them could explain or follow. It's the least documentable of the theories. It's also, in some ways, the most human. Part 6. The physical traces. Here's a question that nags at me. If this was real, is there anything left? Anything you could actually touch? The answer is, not much, but not nothing. Medieval chronicles from the 14th and 15th centuries mention a commemorative inscription on a wall near the Church of St. Boniface. The original is long gone, but multiple independent chroniclers copied it, and their copies agree on the essentials: a date, a number, and the Piper. That level of consistency across independent sources suggests the inscription was considered important for a very long time. It wasn't decorative, it was a record. A stained glass window was also referenced, a visual marker of the disappearance, incorporated into the city's built environment. A 14th century chronicle describes it. The original is gone, but a historical reconstruction now hangs in Hamelin. Then there are the later inscriptions that keep appearing, each one calculating time elapsed since 1284. A stone slab from 1556. Text on a building facade from 1602. They add nothing new factually, but collectively they show a city that kept returning to this date. That couldn't stop marking it. And then there's the street, the Bungalowsenstrasse, translated approximately as the street without music. Local tradition says this was the road through which the children left, and for generations music was not played there. No decree survives confirming the custom, but the name persists, the habit persisted. That kind of thing, a street name, a folk prohibition, is what historians call a living archive. Communities don't maintain centuries-old prohibitions out of habit. They maintain them because something attached to that place hasn't let go of them yet. Part 7. The wound that became a legend. At some point, probably not long after it happened, the people of Hamelin began to transform the loss into something they could live with. This is not weakness. This is what humans do. When pain exceeds explanation, it mutates. It finds a shape that can be carried, a moral, a warning, a symbol. The grief doesn't go away, but it gets a container. The story of the Piper gave the disappearance a logic. He came. He was wronged. He came back. He took the children. There's cause. There's consequence. There's something almost fair about it, in the cruel way that fairness sometimes feels. By the time the Brothers Grimm collected and published the tale in the 19th century, it had been travelling for 500 years, gathering detail with each retelling. The rats appeared. The moral sharpened. The horror became a lesson about keeping your word. But underneath all the embellishment, the Brothers Grimm weren't inventing. They were shaping. Something they found in the historical record of a small German town that, 7 centuries earlier, had experienced something it couldn't name. The fairy tale is not the story. The fairy tale is what happened to the story after the people who lived through it were gone. Part 8. What it means to lose a generation. I want to stay here for a minute, because I think this is the part of the story that gets lost when we talk about historical mysteries. What does it actually mean for a small medieval city to lose a large group of its young people all at once? Not metaphorically, concretely. These were the people who would have inherited the workshops, the farms, the trades, the ones who would have married, had children of their own, carried the community forward. Medieval cities had no reserve capacity for that kind of loss. There was no population to absorb it from outside. You lost 100 young people in 1284, and you felt it for generations. And the grief was not private. In medieval communities, mourning was collective. Bells rang, masses were held. The whole town participated in the acknowledgement of loss, which means the whole town shared whatever could not be explained. The confusion, the guilt, the unanswered questions. We understand now, in ways the 13th century didn't have language for, that trauma transmits, not just through stories, but through silence, through the things a community stops saying, through the streets it avoids, the songs it doesn't sing, the dates it keeps marking without quite knowing why. The children of Hamelin have been dead, or lost, for 740 years. And yet the city still sells tickets to the story, still stages the Piper, still builds its identity around an event that happened before anyone living can trace their direct memory to it. That's not tourism. That's the shape of a wound that never entirely closed. Part 9. The honest accounting. After all of this, the sources, the theories, the traces, here's where we actually stand. What we can say with reasonable confidence. In 1284, a significant number of young people from Hamelin left the city and did not return. The event was impactful enough to be recorded, commemorated in stone, and preserved in street names and local custom across centuries. The oldest sources describe a loss, not a punishment, not a miracle, not a plague, just a departure and an absence. A figure associated with music appears in the early accounts, though his nature and role are unclear. The word used for the missing is baloren, lost, not dead. What we cannot say, who organised the departure, or whether it was organised at all. Whether the young people left willingly, were persuaded, were sold, or were taken by force. What the Piper's actual role was, recruiter, symbol, or something in between. Where the children went, what happened to them, whether they survived. The migration hypothesis is intellectually compelling. The linguistic traces are real, even if they're not conclusive. The framework, young people recruited eastward by a travelling agent, fits the era, but it remains a hypothesis. The children of Hamelin have not been found. Not in the archives of Silesia, not in the settlement records of Prussia, not anywhere we can point to and say, here, they went here. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. What's left is a gap in the historical record that is itself a kind of answer. The answer a city gives when it doesn't know how to tell the truth about what it lost. Part 10. The wider world of dark origins. The story of the Hamelin children is not unique in what it is. It's unique in how little explanation survived alongside it, because history is full of fairy tales with rotten foundations. Take Hansel and Gretel. 2 children abandoned in a forest by parents who can't feed them. A stranger who takes them in only to harm them. The story feels like a nightmare invented for a child's amusement. But historians have traced it to the climate of medieval Europe after the Black Death. Years of failed harvests, little Ice Age winters, genuine famine that pushed families to choices we don't want to name. The witch is not a monster. The witch is starvation. The candy house is a hungry child's most desperate wish. The abandonment in the forest was something that actually happened. documented in enough places to confirm it wasn't exceptional. Take William of Norwich, 1144, a Christian boy found dead, no evidence of anything, no suspect, no motive. And yet within days there were rumours. Jews did it. A community needed an explanation. An explanation was produced. No one proved it. No one needed to. That specific lie would be repeated across Europe for the next 8 centuries, and people would die because of it. Not because it was true, but because it was a shape that grief could use. These stories, the fairy tales, the legends, the cautionary nightmares, they were not created to entertain. They were created to contain. To give the unbearable a border, a beginning and end. To make the inexplicable at least feel like it follows rules. The Pied Piper of Hamelin followed the same path as all the others. The horror was real first. Then came the story. The town of Hamelin still exists. You can visit it, walk its medieval streets, eat at its restaurants, buy a souvenir piper from one of the many shops that stock them. Every summer, actors perform the story in the town square, rats and all. The street without music is still there. The inscriptions counting the years since 1284 are still there. And the question is still there. What happened to the children? The most honest answer we have is also the least satisfying one. We don't fully know. We have fragments. We have echoes. We have a word, Ber-Lorraine, that a medieval city used once and then mostly stopped speaking about. Lost. Not dead. Not taken. Not punished. Just gone. And somewhere in that gap between the departure and the silence, between the historical fact and the fairy tale, between what a city recorded and what it couldn't bring itself to say, somewhere in that gap is the real story. We just don't have all of it yet. Thank you for spending the night in history with us. If you want to keep going, there are more stories like this one. Older wounds, dressed up as bedtime stories. We'll be here. Sleep well.